Hello and welcome to Lady Dynamite Creates. This is Tiffany, and today I'm going to get started on my Rainbow Brite doll. I decided I wanted to do a doll series this year, and I wanted to tackle childhood favorite cartoons from the 80s and 90s that I grew up on. For the first choice, I put a poll up onto my Patreon with a whole list of different cartoon characters that I eventually want to tackle, and they voted, and it actually was a toss-up tie between Rainbow Brite and Strawberry Shortcakes, so I looked through the supplies that I had and decided to work on the one that I needed to buy the least amount for first. Since Rainbow Brite has a very round head, I felt like an ever after sculpt would be perfect for her, so I've chosen the CA Cupid doll. And I've prepped her like normal by shaving down her hair, popping her head off in some boiling water. I scrape out all of the leftover hair and plugs with a screwdriver and a pair of needle nose pliers. I've found that with dolls that have rooted bangs originally that they do tend to have a bit of damaged vinyl there towards the front of the hairline, so to help combat this, I'm going to dump her down into some water and I'm going to boil her for 3 minutes in the microwave. And you can see this helped with the holes significantly and closed them up and unstretched that vinyl. But because she needs bangs for my design as well, I decided I wasn't going to put the extra strain on those holes, and I will be giving her glued in wefts later. Using 100% acetone, I remove her factory paint. I do make sure to wash her afterwards just to make sure I remove all of that acetone residue. One of the things that always screamed Rainbow Brite to me was those bubbly shoes that she had that were so iconically her. I decided I'm going to create an updated pair of my own, and I'm using my base model that I use for all of my 3D sculpted shoes, and I'm just making some changes and updating to have that unique look. I use 3D Studio Max for all of my 3D sculpting, and there's lots of 3D packages out there, but this is the one that I just find easiest for me to use. It was the first one I ever learned to use, and I used it on a daily basis back when I worked in games, so I became more comfortable with the interface. That's not to say the other ones aren't great. I'm just stubborn and I don't want to learn new programs. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of my supporters over on Patreon. AK Magpie, Bex Mini Studios, Camille, Kitsy, Storm Pro Studios, Donna Magana, Angela Hendrickson. Thank you guys so much. If you're interested in becoming one of my patrons, please check the link in the description box below. I have lots of exclusive content just for them. They get to participate in polls as well as see works in progress. Plus, I post lots of videos of exclusive content just for them, like my handling hair and stain removal videos. This month's Dynamite tier reward was a set of 3D printed shoulder pads for Monster High dolls. I really love these shoes and how they turned out. They just scream Rainbow Brite to me. And once I was satisfied with my model, I pop them over to my 3D printer and get them printed. They printed beautifully. However, I did have to print them twice because I ruined the first pair. I'll show you that eventually. But for this pair, I am going to need to get them cleaned up because there's some minor areas that had supports on them. Once I finish with the sanding, I spray them with surface primer and then I can get started painting. My first plan for these was to attach some fabric to them and create them into boots. However, the fabric that I was using that matched her outfit was so thin it kept coming through the fabric and turning it white and gray, so this got scrapped. Hey, but that's what doll customizing is. It's rolling with the punches and figuring things out when things don't go your way. Of course, the glue ruined the other pair, but I've got a new pair printed now, and I've got these sanded and primed, and I'm getting started on the paint job. With my shoes completely base colored out, I'm going to take and cover the top portion of it with some Mod Podge, and then I'm going to sprinkle it with glitter. I swear I think glitter should be like a doll artist battle cry, because anytime anything doesn't go right or you mess up something, it's just like, well, let's put some glitter on it. And you can see I wasn't working fast enough, so some of the areas were already dry by the time I sprinkled my glitter, so I had to do this again. And of course there's glitter all over my house again. What else is new? After my glitter was dry, I added some gold stars to the sides of the shoe. I decided to 3D model her a few other accessories as well. I made her a rainbow key and her rainbow belt buckle. I also decided to give her a ray gun. However, I didn't model this one from scratch. I did some alterations to an existing free file and themed it a bit more towards Rainbow Brite. I know. Rainbow Brite doesn't have a ray gun, but I always thought it was stupid that she shot her magic out of her belt buckle, so I thought it would be so much cooler if she had a gun. My concept for her was more magical retro space girl meets Rainbow Brite, so I wanted her to have aspects of the 1950s retro space girl, but then aspects of a magical girl, because basically that's what Rainbow Brite was. She was like our OG magical girl, but still having the same things that made Rainbow Brite. She would have a similar silhouette to the original costume, but I would be getting rid of the things that I wasn't a fan of, like the big donut tube things on her legs and arms. When I look back at things that I really liked as a child, there's certain ones that just really stand out. You know, there's She-Ra and Jem and the Holograms and Thundercats and G.I. Joe. And most of these, I had memories equally of the cartoon and the toy line. However, with Rainbow Brite, I don't remember the cartoon at all. I had, of course, the Rainbow Brite doll, and I had one of the little sprites and everything. But for me, she wasn't as big of an impact as some of the other ones. My all-time favorite cartoon from when I was a kid was Jem and the Holograms, and I remember being so disappointed that I didn't have more of the dolls. And I had a cousin, and she had all the freaking dolls, and I was so jealous of her because she wouldn't let me play with them when we came over to her house. What's your favorite cartoon from when you were a kid, or something that's just very nostalgic for you? Leave a comment below. It might be one I've forgotten about and can add to my list for this series. Now to start the clothes. For her top, I'm using the top portion of the Rococo dress by Requiem Arts Designs, but I've altered the top a bit. And I'm using stretchy metallic fabric, but I don't want this to stretch, so I am going to be heat pressing some lightweight interfacing to this. Once I have it attached to my pattern pieces, I cut away the excess. I'm first hemming the top of the inset. I clip in the center straight down. This allows the seam allowance to be folded under, and I'm using a bit of fabric fusion glue and applying it, and then using my brand new miniature iron to iron these down flat. This helps activate the glue and set it in place. A big thank you to my daughter and husband for this wonderful Christmas present. This one is so perfect for not distorting the fabric or getting into little tight curves and stuff. I attach the inset to the two front side seams. I'm careful to line up my pieces to their marked areas. Something I find helpful when sewing on such a small scale is to make sure that both threads are always pulled out. You don't want the top thread to be down and wrapped around the bobbin when you start sewing, because it can suck your fabric down in, and when you're using such small seam allowances like with doll clothes, you'll get your whole garment pulled into the sewing machine. I also always keep my walking foot on the sewing machine. This one's not as necessary, but I feel like it does help with feeding the fabric through. Once I have my inset sewn into place, I'm going to use my iron to flatten the seams out, and then I'm going to hem the remainder of the neckline. I clip the seam allowance. This will help the curves stay nice, flat, and even. I use a little bit of fabric fusion glue to help set that in place. I'm using a piece of parchment paper to protect my fabric because the spandex foil wants to scorch. To work on the sleeves, I'm first cutting out a piece of interfacing that's the exact size of what the final sleeve will be. This is not including the seam allowance because I'm trying to cut down on bulk. I adhere this to the blue fabric, and then I'm going to cut out another square and put these right sides facing. I'm going to sew right up against the edge of the interfacing, leaving the bottom open. Once I have these sewn in place, I cut away the excess and then flip them right sides out. I pinned them to the armholes and sew them in place. When sewing on a curve, you have to make sure that you're constantly positioning the fabric and the needle so that there's a smooth line to the stitches. If not, you'll wind up having hard angles and not a smooth curve in your stitch line. This is why you see me lift up the needle after every couple of stitches. I'm just making sure that it goes smoothly. I fold the back to meet the front with right sides facing and sew down the side seams. And of course I got this far and realized I made the neckline a little bit too plunging, and it was very close to having nip slips, and so I needed to remake it. This time her neckline's not quite as plunging, and I added a small gathering stitch there at the top. The last thing I do is hem the bottom and add a closure to the back. For this skirt, I first start with hemming the top edge of the waistband and attaching the white trim to the base of the skirt. This isn't the final skirt shape. I did have to make some changes to make it lay right, but I will have this pattern available for free for my patrons. I've sewn 2 gathering threads, and I'm going to slowly gather the inside edge of the skirt until it's the same length as the waistband. Once I have those to the same size, I'm going to attach them right sides facing and then sew that together. I'm trying to show more of the actual sewing of the garments, and let me know if this is something you enjoy seeing. Remember when sewing with your machine to do a back stitch at the beginning and the end of your stitching. This will help secure the stitches so that they don't pull apart. With the waistband attached, I can remove all of those gathering stitch. I'm just using my seam ripper to gently pick up those stitches and pull out the threads. I can sew up the back seam and add a closure, and then the final thing I do is add in her belt buckle. I'm using some gem tack glue and attaching this to the waistband. Over the years of doll customizing, I've finally become fed up with trying to find fabric that just works. Instead, I've invested this year in a sublimation printer and heat press to make my own custom fabric. So this is what I've done here. Rainbow Brite needed rainbow tights and I needed it at doll scale. So I took to Photoshop, designed me a rainbow, and I'm going to be heat transferring this to some fabric. I'm using polyester spandex, and I just apply this down and I'm securing it with some heat transfer tape, and then I'm closing it up in the heat press. I have replaced this heat press. I was very unhappy with it after I got it and tried it out. It was applying uneven pressure, so that if you notice on the fabric, it's a little bit more faded towards the bottom. I'm so excited about this and all the future applications that I have in store for it, and I will be having a video specifically for my patrons about how I converted my printer into a sublimation printer. It was surprisingly easy. With my custom fabric ready, I flip it onto the back side and I trace out my pattern pieces. Typically when I'm using patterns that are made to be tight, I trace along the actual sew line rather than the seam allowance line. This way I know exactly where it needs to be. In this case, I'm tracing down the center seam and the sewn edge. I've cut out a rough shape around where I've traced out my pattern pieces, and now I'm going to fold over the top edge and sew it with a zigzag stitch. This way it keeps the stretch when it's going to go on the leg. Now I fold this in half along that center marked line that I used, and I'm going to use the marked seam line as my guideline and sew directly on that line. I cut away all of the excess and I flip these right sides out. I try them on my doll and you can see they are a perfect fit. They are nice and snug. Love them. I've made a pattern for her gloves and I've cut it out of the same rainbow material as her tights, and I'm first going to hem that top edge, the one that's near her hands, folding these over and gluing them in place. I fold right sides facing and I sew up the back seams, and I do this on the top cuffs as well. I wind up not attaching the cuffs directly to this. I couldn't figure out a good way to do this without a lot of stitching showing, so they are just going to be loose and floating. I do wind up adding a loop of embroidery thread at the tip of these gloves so that they stay flush down to her hands when she's posed. Now onto her face up. These are all of the different products and colors that I used along the way. I've gotten her prepped and sealed with 2 layers of Mr. Super Clear before I start working on the doll. This just gives the doll a paper-like texture to the vinyl so that it's easier for pastels and pencils to draw on and keeps them from staining the doll in case you mess up and decide you don't like it. I do always try to wear a cotton glove when working on my dolls. This way I don't get any oils or dirt from my hands onto it when I'm working. And you can see that I use it a lot too, to just pull off extra pastel from my brushes or cleaning off the tip of a pencil. This way it serves a little bit of double duty. The first thing I start on any face up is always the eyes. I feel like if I can get that down, it makes everything else come a little bit easier. I also tend to do a lot of erasing when I'm trying to get these shapes down because I have trouble getting things symmetrical. So this is a brand new product that I'm just trying out. My husband and daughter bought this for me for Christmas, and it's a colorless blender from Pastels. It basically just puts down a base of powder for you to use so that when you're blending out your other pastels, they're blending a little bit more naturally and you're not getting areas that stick more to a certain spot. And I have to say that once I did start actually applying pastel and doing shading to the face, it did seem to apply more smoothly and the colors blended better. Once I finished all the pencil and pastel work on this layer, the final thing I like to do is my application of my mica powders. She's Rainbow Brite, so I felt like she needed some shimmer, and so I'm applying a little bit of shimmer to her cheeks and her eyeshadow area. I apply this on every layer because the Mr. Super Clear really knocks down this shimmery mica powder, so if you're applying it every layer, it will eventually build up and give you a nice shimmer. At the start of layer 2, I begin with her irises, and I struggled a lot with these. I got them down and I erased them, and then I got it and changed it some more, but then erased it, and I put them down and erased so many times that they quit building up, so I just erased them completely, and I'm going to try again on the next layer. For now, I'm just going to fill in the whites of her eyes. I did want to get an opinion on how you guys are liking the videos as far as my narration on the face-ups. I know a lot of these are just the same steps over and over in each video, so do you prefer it like I have it now where I'm detailing out each step that I'm doing on each face-up? Or would you prefer me just to kind of step in here and there when I'm doing things out of the ordinary? Just let me know. Do you want me to shut up or not? I've added some pinks and some reds to her waterline, and I'm making sure to keep the deeper reds towards the corners of her eyes. And I darken her eyeliner with some black pencil. I'm using a very sharp pencil so that I make sure I get a fine line. I use a brown watercolor pencil to sketch in her eyelid crease and define some shadows there. I darken her eyeshadow with some black pearlescent pen pastels. However, I did go a little too heavy-handed and had to pull this back later. I used some white pastel to highlight the high points on her face, like the forehead and the bridge of the nose and tops of the cheeks. I did feel like that the pastels alone weren't giving the ears enough contrast, so I'm going in with my pencil and defining some of those tighter curves. On layer 3, I tackled those irises again, and I have much better success this time around. I get the iris shape defined, and I start blocking in those colors. Before I go any further on layer 3, I tackle her eyebrows. I always do a ton of erasing, so I just plop that pastel on there, and then I start refining it with my pencil eraser. When I'm happy with the shape, I start using a brown pencil to add in some tiny hairs, and I'm just doing little flicks in the direction that the hair grows, so you'll see me come in from the top and the bottom. I use my white watercolor pencil to bring some highlights to the face, and these are just the highlights that I want to be a little bit more pronounced and less subtle. After that, I add more mica powder, and then I give it a final seal before I start layer 4. On layer 4, I first start with haloing her pupil, and then I give her some flicks and striations to the eyes in different colors. I felt like the haloing of the pupil gave her a softer feel and more innocent look. I like the more painterly quality that this invoked because it put me in mind of the original Hallmark cards where she was first depicted in her watercolor paintings. The Rainbow Brite character actually started as a character for a greeting card company that evolved into a toy line and cartoon. It's just really interesting. I use a gray watercolor pencil to add some shading around her sclera. This is just going to give the eye a little bit rounder appearance. And after I'm satisfied with that, I hit up her eyelashes, and I'm just doing light flicks across the top and the bottom. When I'm drawing the lashes, I'm making sure that the ones on the outside edge of the eye are longer and the ones on the inside are shorter. I of course can't forget the star on her cheek, so I'm getting that sketched in now. I use some pastel to shade out her eyes even further, and I'm going to pop up that haloing effect even more by adding some mica powder right into the center of the pupil. I darken up the bottom of her lashes in that lash line with my Derwent Inktense pencil. This is a very dark black pencil, so it really gives that pop of richness. And apparently because I like living on the edge, I'm not going to seal. I'm just going to go straight in and add in her highlights to her waterline and her catch lights. I'm using a little bit of Artesic wash to do this. You should probably seal before doing this. Don't be like me, because I ran a big risk of just ruining my face up, because this is going directly on to watercolor pencils that haven't been sealed. So I very well could have just ruined all my work. Worked out in the end, but you know. Now to start on her hair. I wanted a blend of these three colors, so I'm getting them prepped by cutting long strips of them, and then on the two chunkier pieces, I unwind all of the strands. And on the center one, I just had to remove the thread that runs through the middle of the piece. Once I have all the yarn separated into their individual pieces, I'm going to flat iron them. This will help with the separation of the fibers later on. To separate those fibers, I'm gripping the yarn at the very tip, barely holding onto anything and pulling. This is just going to pull the separate fibers out. Once I've done this to all three yarns, I'm going to take those hanks that I've separated out and I'm going to start blending them. To blend them, I'm going to pull on either ends and then bring the ends back together, and I'm going to do this a million times just until the colors get blended together. Once I'm happy with my blend, I take the yarn and I'm taking a small section and I'm thinning it out, making sure it's nice and even, and flatten it onto my tile here, and I'm going to apply Mod Podge just to the top end. I try to keep a relatively neat line because it'll help me later on when applying these wefts. Once the glue is dry, I can pull the wefts off of the tile and trim away the excess. To apply the wefts, I'm using some liquid fusion glue, and I've marked on the head where I want her fringe to lay. First, I lay out all the bangs, and I make sure to keep two pieces out that are going to be wispy little curls on the sides of her head. I trim off the excess as I go because this makes it easier for the styling later on. I allow this to dry in between layers. When I start the next row of her bangs, I'm using the cutoff from the previous set. I wanted to say thank you so much for being so patient and waiting on this video. I know it's been a month since my last upload, and usually when I've done this long in between dolls, it's a much bigger project, but I took some time off to recharge right around Christmas and just spend some time with my family. I know I always say, always be creating, but sometimes you just need to take that break so that you can get those creative juices flowing again. When I'm finished with her bangs, I begin on the rest of the hair. I apply this first row to the very outer edge, and I'm making sure that it faces out away from the base of where the ponytail will be. The next rows get applied towards the base of the ponytail. We're also not going to fill in that middle. We're going to kind of leave her with a little monk style because it's going to be pulled back and you won't see it. For the ponytail itself, I'm taking a chunk of wefts and I'm rolling them up into a ponytail shape. Once the glue's had a chance to dry, I'm going to trim down the tip of this and make sure that it's flat, and then I'm going to hot glue this to where the ponytail should come out from. I gently brush the hair back and pull it into a ponytail and secure it with a hair tie. I give the bangs a final trim, and I'm cutting at them at a perpendicular angle with my scissors. This is going to give them a nice feathering effect so that they're not quite so blunt on the ends. I style her hair into some loose curls using metal rods, chopsticks, and my flat iron. And of course, doll bangs never want to lay down flat, so I'm encouraging them by misting them with some water, and then I'm using my toothbrush to help flatten them out some, and I'm further setting the style by very carefully using my flat iron on those bangs. And finally, I finish off her hair with a blue ribbon and star bead. And a big thank you to Jackie O. The star bead and the stars that I used on her shoes and outfit all came from her, and it was the perfect accents for this doll. At the time this video goes live, this doll will be available for purchase on my Etsy store. If you are interested, please check out the link in the description box below. The last thing to do is get her dressed. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate all your support. And remember, always be creating!